You're a Mongol general. You've witnessed unspeakable horrors. You've seen cities burn, heard the screams of thousands, watched rivers run red with blood. Nothing shocks you anymore. You've become numb to it all. But then one day in 1220, standing in the ruins of one of the world's greatest cities, you watch your Khan, the man you'd follow into hell itself, give an order so methodical, so coldly calculated that for the first time in your battle-hardened life, you feel something you thought you'd forgotten. Horror. Not at the violence. You're used to violence. At the system behind it. Because what Genghis Khan did to his slaves wasn't just brutal. It was something far more disturbing. It was legal. It was organized. And it was justified by the very same laws that promised equality and justice for his own people. This is the story of how the boy who wore a slave's yoke became the man who built the largest empire in human history on a foundation of organized human trafficking. And the truly terrifying part, the system he created was so effective, so rational, so perfectly designed that even today scholars struggle to reconcile the progressive lawgiver with the architect of systematic dehumanization. Stay with me because by the end of this video you'll understand why Genghis Khan's approach to slavery was infinitely more dangerous than simple barbarism. And you'll see why that matters for understanding power structures that still exist today. Let me take you back to the 1170s to the frozen steppes of Mongolia. A teenager named Temujin sits in complete darkness, his neck and hands locked in a wooden kangu, a torture device designed for farm animals. The wood digs into his flesh. He can't lie down. He can't feed himself. He can't even scratch his face. Every night he's dragged to a different tent, a different guard. He's not a person anymore. He's an object, a trophy. Living proof that his captives have broken his clan. But here's what's fascinating. While most prisoners in his situation would be fantasizing about escape or revenge, young Temujin is studying. He's watching, learning, taking mental notes. He notices that the guards get drunk, that they grow careless, that on the night of a festival when everyone is celebrating, discipline collapses completely. He waits. And on that night, he makes his move. But he doesn't just escape. He convinces one of his captives, a young man who'd shown him a shred of kindness, to help him. Even in chains, Temujin was already mastering the art that would define his empire. Understanding what motivates people and using that knowledge ruthlessly. But the kangu wasn't his first education in powerlessness. Years earlier, when Temujin was just 9 years old, his father, was murdered, poisoned by rivals at a feast, the ultimate betrayal of steppe hospitality. And in that moment, everything changed. His father's clan held a meeting. These were people who'd sworn loyalty to his family, who'd shared food and fought battles together. And one by one, they looked at Temujin's mother, Holun, and her 5 young children, and made a calculation. These 6 mouths to feed were a liability, now a burden. So they left them in the middle of winter on the open steppe. Imagine being 9 years old and watching the only community you've ever known literally ride away from you, watching them choose survival over loyalty, watching them abandon a woman and 5 children to almost certain death. Holun kept them alive through sheer force of will. She taught them to dig for roots, to trap marmots, to eat things that weren't food, but would fill a stomach. A clan leader's widow reduced to foraging like an animal. But young Temujin learned something else during those desperate years, that every social bond, every sacred tradition, every oath of loyalty meant absolutely nothing when survival was at stake. The only thing that mattered was power, raw, undeniable, terrifying power, the kind of power that made betrayal impossible because the cost was too high. These experiences, the abandonment, the enslavement, the escape, forged something unique in Temujin's mind. He didn't just want revenge. He didn't just want power. He wanted to rebuild society itself according to a completely different logic. Think about it. Traditional Mongol society was organized around family and tribe. Your loyalty was to your clan. But Tujin had learned the hard way that family would abandon you, that tribal bonds were worthless, that the whole system was fundamentally broken. So he began to envision something radical, a society where loyalty wasn't based on blood, but on law, where advancement wasn't based on who your father was, but on merit and absolute obedience, where betrayal wasn't just shameful, it was impossible because the punishment was so swift and so certain that no one would dare. But here's the dark foundation of that vision. If you're going to reorganize society from scratch, you need to draw a line somewhere. You need to define who's in and who's out, who the laws protect and who they don't. And Temujin, the boy who'd been treated as less than human, who'd worn the slave's yoke, was about to draw that line in blood. The year is 1206. After decades of brutal warfare, Temujin has done the impossible. He's conquered or absorbed every major tribe on the Mongolian steppe. The constant raids, the blood feuds, the cycle of revenge that had defined Mongol life for centuries, it's over. A great assembly is called, a Kurultai. Representatives from all the tribes gather by the Wonan River. And there, under a white banner with 9 tails, Temujin is proclaimed Genghis Khan, oceanic ruler or possibly universal ruler, depending on who's translating. But Genghis doesn't celebrate by launching foreign conquests. Not yet. His first act is something far more radical. He announces a new legal code that will govern this new nation, the Yasa. Now, when historians first study the Yasa, they're often genuinely impressed. For the 13th century, some of these laws were shockingly progressive. First, it became illegal to kidnap women. In a society where bride kidnapping was common practice, this was revolutionary. Women gained certain property rights. Adultery was punishable by death for both parties equally. Second, all children were legitimate, even those born to slave mothers or concubines. In a world obsessed with lineage and pure blood, this was radical. It meant that a man born to an enslaved woman could theoretically rise to command armies. Third, religious tolerance was mandated. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and shamanists could practice freely. Genghis himself used to consult with religious leaders from multiple faiths. In an era of religious warfare, this was genuinely enlightened. Fourth, a meritocracy was established. Promotion in the military wasn't based on noble birth, but on ability. A shepherd could become a general if he proved his worth. And perhaps most tellingly, it became illegal for any Mongol to be enslaved. If a Mongol was captured, any other Mongol who encountered them was legally obligated to free them or face severe punishment. Reading these laws, you'd think Genghis Khan, the boy who'd worn the slave's yoke, was building a just society based on his own suffering. You'd think he'd learned empathy from his trauma. You'd be completely wrong, because buried in the Yasa were other provisions, quieter ones that revealed the true architecture of this new world. The same law that forbade the enslavement of Mongols, it explicitly allowed the enslavement of non-Mongs. The same law that mandated helping enslaved Mongols escape, it prescribed the death penalty for anyone who helped a non-Mongol slave escape. Religious tolerance, absolutely, as long as you paid your taxes and provided tribute when demanded, and part of that tribute could be human. Do you see what he did? He didn't abolish slavery. He weaponized it. He created a system where all the progressive enlightened laws applied exclusively to one group, Mongols, while everyone else existed in a legal gray zone where they had no protections whatsoever. But the Yasa did something even more fundamental. It completely dismantled the traditional tribal structure. Genghis reorganized the entire Mongol population and army into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. An Arban was 10 men, a Jagan was 100, a Minkan was 1,000, and a Tumen was 10,000. Your commander wasn't your clan chief anymore. Your loyalty wasn't to your family. It was to your unit and ultimately to the Khan himself. If even one man in a unit of 10 fled from battle, the entire unit would be executed. If one unit in a group of 10 units broke, all 10 units would be punished. This created a system of collective responsibility that made betrayal not just dangerous for you, but for everyone you cared about. And here's the genius and the horror of it. This system didn't rely on loyalty to a person. It relied on fear of a system. It was self-enforcing. It was impersonal. It was perfect. The first crack in the facade came early with a governor named K'Chi. Genghis had appointed K'Ca to govern tribes in the forest regions of Siberia. By all accounts, K'Ca was an effective administrator. The tribes paid their tribute. Order was maintained. But K'Chi had a weakness. He started abducting local women for his personal harem. Not just one or two, dozens. He was using his position to build a private collection of enslaved women. Now remember, the Yasser explicitly forbade the kidnapping of women. It was one of the most celebrated progressive elements of the law. The local tribes pushed beyond their limits finally rebelled. They captured K'Ci and killed him. So what did Genghis Khan do? Did he praise these tribes for defending their women? Did he acknowledge that K'Ci had violated the sacred law? He sent an army to crush the rebellion. The message was clear. K'Chi's crime wasn't the abductions. It was getting caught. It was causing instability. It was creating administrative chaos that required military intervention to solve. The Yasa protected women, Mongol women, everyone else. They were in a different category entirely. And his generals, who'd been genuinely impressed by the progressive nature of the Yasa, started to understand that they'd misread the situation. The law wasn't about justice. It was about efficiency. It was about creating a stable, powerful Mongol nation that could project force outward without cannibalizing itself. But they didn't fully understand the implications. Not yet. Not until Bukhara. Let me set the scene for you. It's 1220. Bukhara is one of the greatest cities in the Islamic world, a center of learning, art, and commerce. The libraries here contain knowledge from across the known world. The craftsmen produce textiles and metalwork so beautiful that kings from Europe to China compete to own them. The markets overflow with silk, spices, and ideas. The population is somewhere around 30,000 people, protected by supposedly impregnable walls and a garrison of soldiers. And Genghis Khan is coming. The Mongol army arrives like a thunderstorm, but they don't immediately attack. Instead, they wait. They surround the CI. Thank you completely, cut off all supply routes, and they send a message to the governor. Surrender now. Pay tribute. Acknowledge Mongol authority and the city will be spared. Resist and face total annihilation. The governor makes a fatal miscalculation. He looks at his walls, his soldiers, his vast supplies, and thinks he can wait them out. He sends back a refusal. The Mongols don't waste time with a prolonged siege. They divert a nearby river, flooding the city's defensive moat and destroying the walls. Within days, the outer defenses collapse. The Turkish garrison, realizing the battle is lost, tries to fight their way out. They're cut down almost to a man. The city's citadel holds out for 12 more days, but it's pointless. When it finally falls, every soldier inside is executed. But here's what's interesting. The civilian population isn't massacred. Not yet. Genghis Khan himself enters the city. He rides directly to the Grand Mosque, the holiest site in Bukhara. His soldiers throw the sacred Qurans onto the floor. They use the ornate chests that held these holy texts as feed troughs for their horses. Then he orders the city's elite, the wealthy merchants, the religious leaders, the nobility to gather in the mosque's courtyard. Imagine being in that crowd. You've just watched your city fall in days. You've seen your soldiers butchered. And now you're standing in front of this short, surprisingly unremarkable-looking man with cold, calculating eyes. And he speaks, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Think about the psychological warfare of that statement. He's using their own religious framework against them. He's telling them that their own God has sent him to destroy them, that their suffering is divine judgment. It's not just conquest, it's theological annihilation. But then something pens that will haunt his generals for the rest of their lives. The Mongol soldiers don't go on a rampage. There's no orgy of violence, no chaotic looting, no random slaughter. Instead, they start sorting. The entire population of Bukhara is divided into categories. First category, skilled artisans, weavers who can create the finest textiles, metal workers who can forge weapons and armor, engineers who understand siege equipment and irrigation systems, scribes who can read and write multiple languages. These people are registered. Their names are written down. Their skills are cataloged. They're told they will be relocated to Karakoram, the Mongol capital, where they will work for the KHN. Their families can come with them. They'll be fed, housed, and protected as long as they work. It's not freedom, but it's not death either. It's a strange kind of privileged slavery. Second category, young, able-bodied men. These are sorted out and formed into labor battalions. But here's where it gets truly dark. They're not just laborers. They're human shields. In the next siege, these men from Bukhara will be driven ahead of the Mongol army. They'll be forced to fill in mows with their own bodies to scale walls and absorb the first wave of arrows to die so that Mongol soldiers don't have to. It's psychological warfare on a massive scale. Defenders in the next city will look over their walls and see their neighbors, their fellow Muslims, being driven forward by Mongol whips. The moral horror of killing their own people often breaks the city's will to fight before the actual battle begins. Third category, women and children. These are further subdivided. The young, attractive women are distributed as property to Mongol soldiers or sent to slave markets. Some are kept as concubines. Others become domestic servants. The children are often adopted into Mongol households, not out of kindness, but as a form of cultural assimilation. Raised from young ages, they forget their original language, their original culture, and become functionally Mongol. It's cultural genocide through adoption. Fourth category, the elderly, the sick, the disabled, and those with no useful skills. These people simply disappear from the historical record. We can make educated guesses about their fate, and none of those guesses are pleasant. Now, imagine you're one of Genghis Khan's generals watching this unfold. You've been following this man for years. You believed in the Yasa. You believe that you were building something better than the chaotic, violent steppe life of the past, and now you're watching an entire city being processed like cattle. You're watching human beings reduced to economic units. You're watching the same man who forbade the enslavement of Mongols oversee the systematic enslavement of tens of thousands of people. And then it hits you. The Yasa was never meant to protect people. It was meant to protect Mongols. Everyone else isn't covered by the law. They're not even human in the legal sense. They're resources, assets, property. One Mongol officer, whose account was later recorded by Persian historians, described it like this. We had seen cities destroyed before. We had killed without mercy. But this was different. This was organized. It felt like we were farmers harvesting a crop, not warriors conquering an enemy. And I realized that in the KHN's vision, that's exactly what we were. Some generals embraced this new reality enthusiastically. They became administrators of human trafficking on an industrial scale. They grew wealthy beyond imagination. But others struggled with it, not because they were squeamish about violence. Remember, these were men who'd spent their lives in brutal warfare, but because the system violated something fundamental about how they understood warfare. In traditional steppe combat, you fought your enemy. You defeated them. You took their stuff and maybe took some slaves. But there was a certain comprehensibility to it, a beginning and an end. This was different. This was turning conquest into a repeatable industrial process. It was the bureaucratization of human suffering. And the truly disturbing part, it worked. It worked incredibly well. After Bikar came Samarkand, then Nishapur, then Baghdad. Each city that fell fed the machine. Estimates suggest that during the Mongol conquests, between 1 and 2 million people were forcibly relocated across the empire. That's not counting those killed or those enslaved, but kept in their home regions. Think about the logistics of moving 1 million people across Asia in the 13th century. The organization required the rekordepping, the supply chains to feed them on the march. The Mongols developed an entire administrative apparatus just for managing conquered populations. They created a registry system that tracked skilled workers across the empire. A blacksmith taken from Bukhara might find himself in Karakoram working alongside a Chinese engineer and a Russian goldsmith. It was in a twisted way one of the first truly global workforces. But here's what made the system even more insidious. It created a hierarchy among the enslaved populations themselves. At the top were the skilled artisans in Mongol service. They had a strange kind of security. As long as they produced, they were valuable. They were fed. Their families were safe. Below them were domestic servants and concubines. Their fate depended entirely on their owners' whim, but they at least lived in relative comfort. Below them were agricultural laborers and general workers. They did the backbreaking work of the empire, but they were alive and had a minimal chance of improving their situation. At the very bottom were the hasher, the human shields. Their life expectancy, once assigned to this role, could be measured in months. This hierarchy created competition among the enslaved. The artisan didn't want to be reclassified as a laborer. The laborer didn't want to become harsher, so they worked harder. They didn't rebel. They informed on each other. The system made the enslaved population police itself. The economic impact was staggering. Mongol nobles who'd been relatively poor by steppe standards became obscenely wealthy. A single successful campaign could net a Mongol officer dozens of skilled slaves, hundreds of pounds of gold and silver, and valuable trade contacts. Some generals essentially became human traffickers, selling their captives to other parts of the empire or to foreign markets. The Mongol capital of Karakoram transformed from a tent city into a cosmopolitan metropolis built by enslaved artisans from a dozen different conquered peoples. The great palace had Chinese roofs, Persian gardens, and European metalwork. It was a monument to organized exploitation. But perhaps the most effective aspect of the system was how it weaponized fear. The Mongols developed a sophisticated propaganda network. Merchants, travelers, and survivors would spread tales of the sorting of entire populations being processed, of the cold efficiency of Mongol conquest. And here's the genius of it. These stories made cities surrender without a fight. When the Mongol army showed up outside a city, the defenders knew exactly what would happen if they resisted. They'd seen what happened to Bukhara, to Samarkand. They knew about the categories, about the sorting. So many cities simply opened their gates. They accepted vassalage. They paid tribute. They provided the demanded percentage of their population for Mongol service. In this way, the system of organized slavery became a tool of bloodless conquest. The horror of it was so well known that the mere threat was enough. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, and every single one of them maintained the system. Hulagu, who conquered Baghdad in 1258, used the same sorting process. Kublai Khan in China institutionalized it into Chinese law. The Golden Horde in Russia made it part of their tribute demands from Russian princes. The system outlived its creator by centuries. Elements of it persisted in Central Asia until the Russian conquest in the 19th century. That's 600 years of continuity for a system of organized human trafficking. Here's what makes Genghis Khan so difficult for historians to assess. By the standards of his own people, he was a genuinely progressive leader. He promoted by merit, not birth. He protected women, Mongol women, from abuse. He granted religious freedom. He created a legal code that brought unprecedented stability to the steppes. Mongol life expectancy increased under his rule. Crime dropped. Trade flourished. For the average Mongol, the Genghis Khan era was a golden age, but that golden age was built on a foundation of systematic dehumanization of everyone else. It's tempting to dismiss him as simply evil, as a monster, but that's too simple. Monsters are chaotic. Genghis Khan was rational. He built systems. He created laws, he planned for generations, and that's actually more terrifying than random brutality. Now, I want to be very careful here because drawing direct parallels to modern situations is dangerous and often inaccurate. But the underlying logic, the idea that you can have progressive laws for your people while systematically exploiting everyone outside that circle, this isn't some ancient aberration. Colonial powers in the 18th and 19th centuries built empires on exactly this logic. Britain had rule of law at home while extracting wealth through organized exploitation in India and Africa. France proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity while maintaining brutal colonial regimes. The American founding fathers wrote that all men are created equal while maintaining chattel slavery. The Nazis implemented progressive social programs for Aryan Germans while industrializing genocide. The pattern repeats. Draw a circle around us, create laws that protect us, and then treat everyone outside that circle as a resource to be exploited. Genghis Khan didn't invent this logic, but he perfected it in a way that made it disturbingly effective. So, how do we judge Genghis Khan? In Mongolia today, he's celebrated as a national hero, the founding father, the man who unified the Mongol people and created an empire. And from that perspective, they're not wrong. He did do that in Iran, Central Asia, and parts of Eastern Europe. He's remembered as a catastrophic destroyer. Entire cities and civilizations were wiped out. The death toll of the Mongol conquests is estimated between 30 and 40 million people, roughly 10% of the world's population at the time. Both views are accurate. That's the uncomfortable truth. Which brings us back to where we started. The moment when Genghis Khan's generals watched the sorting of Bukhara and realized what they'd become part of. Some of them walked away from that experience troubled but ultimately accepted it as the price of empire. Others embraced it fully and built their fortunes on it. A few, very few, expressed doubts in writings that survive to this day. But none of them stopped because they couldn't. The system was too big, too efficient, too embedded in the structure of the empire. And maybe that's the most disturbing lesson of all, that people can be aware they're part of something monstrous and still participate because the system makes opting out impossible. So here's the question I'll leave you with. How many systems exist in our world right now where people know something is fundamentally wrong but participate anyway because the system is too big to fight, where we draw invisible lines between people who matter and people who don't? How often do we, like those Mongol generals, convince ourselves that the efficiency of a system justifies its inhumanity? The story of Genghis Khan's slavery system isn't just about one historical figure or one empire. It's about how easily humans can rationalize organized cruelty when it's dressed up in the language of law, efficiency, and civilization. The boy who wore the slave's yoke became the man who built an empire on systematic enslavement.